Gerontology is the study of aging, but it's the study of transitions, which include things like menopause. It's a holistic study then that focuses on, for me, the positive, as well as acknowledging that there are challenges that we face during these transitions and during that aging process, with the overall aim to better understand aging in all of its facets, to hopefully facilitate that optimal aging experience.
They find that sex is important to them. That is true. And actually, doctors are not screening older adults for STDs or something. But in fact, you said it was a real problem, right?
Oh, it absolutely is a real problem. I mean, I know the US has many challenges. One of the big ones that I see is that, for example, the CDC doesn't recommend testing for STIs for people over the age of 65. There's no guidance for this. People don't stop having sex. And the problem that we see in healthcare, again, as you go back to, is ageism, because clinicians don't want to speak to people the same age as their grandparents about having sex. And then on the flip side, many older adults don't want to speak to somebody in their 20s or 30s that they don't know about their sexual lives, or especially if they're experiencing challenges in that particular area. So it's something we need to come at from multiple angles, but it's a really important message to get out there, I feel.
Yeah, I've interviewed a lot of sexologists, and because low libido is an issue during this menopause transition. And it's one of these things that still, I mean, women in their 50s, this is pretty much the audience more or less who's listening, have trouble talking about it. And that's why I'm trying to open this conversation and say, like, it's something important. And I did a really interesting interview with Dr. Kelly Casperson, and she talks a lot about testosterone and libido, and you're not broken, et cetera, et cetera. And she said there may be studies on sex. There's, well, I guess a lot of studies on sex and sexual behavior, but not so much on pleasure, and not so much on pleasure for women, which she thought, well, that's important because you could be having sex, but not good sex, just doing it just because to please your husband or something like that. And that was not okay. I'm wondering, is it true? Is it just that we don't have these studies on pleasure?
Frame it like this. So in our 20s, 30s, we don't see sex as a biological act necessarily. But when we get to our 60s and 70s, it might be about what medications you need to be able to do this, or what processes can be used. It becomes very medicalized. And I don't know about you, but I don't find that very sexy. And that might be part of the problem. And when it comes to doing research, obviously we know at the moment much research is being cut back, but we're interested in that biomedical approach, when instead we should be taking that biopsychosocial approach and saying, well, actually, there are certain challenges that happen as we age. So, for example, it might be to do with, you talked about women's enjoyment. What about vaginal dryness? Are we addressing the issues there? Maybe actually talking about things like that will enhance the enjoyment for women. And it should be enjoyable for both parties. It shouldn't just be mechanistic, the same as it isn't in younger age. But we need to focus on the lived experience rather than just somebody in their 20s or 30s or 40s just saying, okay, this is the problem, let's fix it this way. I agree with you. I think this is a really genuinely exciting moment for this topic. And it's more than just awareness. It's about how menopause is reshaping conversations about age, about power, about knowledge, and about values, because menopause is moving from private failure to a public transition. So for decades, menopause has been framed as a medical problem that needs to be fixed, or a personal embarrassment that we have to manage quietly. And in terms of what's changing, menopause is increasingly being discussed as a biological transition, but with social consequences, very similar to how we discuss puberty, but there's far less institutional support when it comes to menopause. I think public figures, workplace policies, and media narratives are kind of starting to break that silence. This reframing exposes how much of the distress around menopause is socially produced, and by that sense, not inevitable. And ageism is being recognized as part of this as being gendered, and menopause kind of sits at that fault line in the middle. So menopause has been made visible, something that's been long ignored, and women experience ageism earlier, as we know, and more punishingly than men do. That can take the forms of professional credibility, sexual visibility, and cultural authority. But researchers are explicitly now naming gendered ageism rather than treating age and gender separately. So menopause is understood as a trigger point where sexism and ageism combine. So menopause then becomes that case study for how systems devalue people as their bodies change. So historically, research was underfunded, it's been male-dominated, and it's been really biomedical, as we just discussed. Women's reports are largely dismissed or anecdotal or being seen as emotional. But now it's more about the lived experience. And this is being treated as data rather than just noise. And we do that by embracing a feminist approach, qualitative research, and also participatory design. So nothing about us without us. And this challenges whose knowledge counts. And that's really big academically, because menopause is making visible the cost of a society that's organized around youth, uninterrupted productivity, and also male-bodied norms. And in doing so, for me, it offers a bit of a blueprint to a more humane system for everyone. That goes to that intersection of how ageism often happens for women, or how we pathologize women with regards to the menopause. So going to what you were saying, I mean, cognitive changes, especially during menopause, are the ones that people focus on. And cognitive changes are immediately pathologized in women. So as you know, for many women, menopause-related cognitive shifts, that could be like brain fog, word finding, etc., they're normal, they're common, but they're often very temporary. They're closely linked to those estrogen fluctuations that you mentioned before, but also the stress that's associated to it. But when we put ageism and sexism together, that often means that women say, well, when a word becomes forgotten, well, what's wrong with me? Or a moment of confusion becomes, oh, my life, is this dementia? So women are taught that their visibility depends on this cognitive sharpness. So by midlife, many women have survived by being organized, verbally fluent, emotionally attuned. And ageism tells women then that your value is tied to your flawless performance and that there's no grace period for this transition. So the fear isn't just about memory, as I see it, as a fear about social survival. So medical ageism amplifies this fear. So women are told that their concerns are more likely to be dismissed as stress or as anxiety, or even catastrophized without any sort of context. But what's missing is a clear education that menopause affects working memory. It does affect verbal recall, and it also affects focus. But we need to give reassurance about patterns. We need to talk about a longitudinal perspective. So without framing this, women fill the gap, and most are frightened because they don't have explanations that are available. That's why your podcasts are so informative and so important. What women are often reacting to then is not cognitive decline, it's that anticipated social erasure. And ageism teaches women that aging minds are suspect, or that any crack invites dismissal. So menopause then becomes that moment of existential threat, not just a hormonal change. So I guess if I can put that shortly, I'd say that menopause-related brain fog is usually contextual and usually reversible. So while dementia is progressive, it's pattern forming, and ageism tends to collapse this distinction together and leaves women afraid of their own normal brains.
Social isolation and loneliness.
I would say 9 out of 10, because it's one of the strongest predictors of poor health, cognitive decline, early mortality. And we know the stats around comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day when we look at effect sizes, that kind of thing.
Beliefs about aging.
This is again built on Becca Levy's work. I would say about 7 out of 10. It's certainly not fluff research, but when we look at longitudinal evidence, it shows us that beliefs independently predict function, recovery, cardiovascular health, and cultural ageism then becomes embodied.
Hormonal transitions like menopause.
I don't want to upset you or your listeners on this. I know I should be saying 10 out of 10, but I would say probably 5. Because there are real biological effects, absolutely, but it is really context dependent, depending on whether you've got a supportive environment or not. So on their own, I think they have a moderate impact, but under chronic stress, it's much more impactful.
Sleep.
9. I would go hazard this without guessing. I'm saying this as somebody that chronically undersleeps. For me, this is non-negotiable because it affects our cognition, our immune system, our cardiovascular health, our mood, inflammation, everything, and it really accelerates aging.
Chronic stress.
I think this is a ding, ding, ding moment, 10 out of 10. Because this drives allostatic load, inflammation, immuno-aging, cardiovascular health, everything. All these other things that we've talked about are all about the stress response.
Purpose and meaning.
I think that's about 2. So I see that as really kind of protective because it's one of the most robust factors that we have. And we know it's associated with lower mortality, better cognition, etc. And it buffers the biological stress.
Discrimination, ageism, racism, sexism, all the isms.
I'm going to shy away from saying 10 out of 10. I'm going to say 9 out of 10 because it operates through vigilance, stress, reduced access to care, etc., and has real profound population effect. But we can also challenge those. It's about changing that implicit to explicit, having that conversation.
Movement or exercise? This
is easy. This is a protective one. So I'd say either 1 or 2. So it's protective across the whole of the life course. It helps us with mobility, cognition, mood, mortality rates. Even modest movement really does matter.
Ultra-processed foods like Skittles.
I was about to say, I love my Skittles. So I'm going to be a little biased here. I'm going to say maybe 6 out of 10. Because yes, ultra-processed foods are definitely linked to metabolic disease, inflammation, early mortality, etc. Especially, however, when they're paired with stress and food insecurity. But if they make you feel good in small doses, sometimes that goodness, that happiness might actually be worth the offset as long as we're not doing it on a daily basis.
Organic foods.
I'm going to hedge my bets and say about 2 or 3. On a population level, I think there's a bit of a marginal benefit to eating this kind of organic diet, but often we overemphasize it compared to far more powerful social factors. But just eating more like fresh fruit, vegetables, etc., whether it's organic or not. I don't want to marginalize organic and say you must eat organic because sometimes that's not accessible to people. So by just saying it needs to be organic, we're losing a lot of people.
Noise pollution.
I think this is about 5 or 6 out of 10, as we said in that mind-body class. It's underappreciated, but it is real. So chronic noise exposure affects our sleep, it affects cardiovascular risk, and it makes us stressed, especially in urban, but particularly lower income settings.
Economic security.
I think this is a biggie. This I'd say maybe 9 out of 10, because this is pretty foundational to our everyday lives. Whether we wake up in a cold sweat worrying whether we can pay our mortgage, it predicts our health span, and more strongly than some other biomarkers. And it shapes our exposure to nutrition, healthcare access, and also our ability to recover.
Access to healthcare.
I'm not going to reflect on America. I think this is necessary, but it's not sufficient. So access affects prevention. Early treatment, as we know, and symptom burden, especially when care is respectful and culturally competent. So yes, access to healthcare is massively important, but we need those caveats where it is respectful, where it is culturally competent, and people aren't afraid to access it.